The quiet hum of exclusivity in the Zenith Premier Lounge at JFK was a carefully curated symphony composed of the clink of crystal on marble, the whisper of Italian leather, and the scent of freshly brewed espresso. It was a sanctuary for the world's elite, a bubble where the chaos of travel couldn't penetrate. But on a crisp autumn afternoon, a discordant note was struck. A man walked in who didn't belong in the orchestra. His clothes were worn, his face was tired, and he carried the dust of the real world on his boots. They saw him, and they judged him instantly. They called him homeless. They called security. They had no idea they weren't just judging a man. They were judging the very architect of their sanctuary. And that judgment was about to cost them everything. The Zenith Premier Lounge in John F. Kennedy International Airport's Terminal 4 was less a waiting area and more a statement. Its sprawling space was a testament to minimalist luxury, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the giant steel birds taking flight. The patrons mirrored the decor, sleek, polished, and expensive. Men in tailored Tom Ford suits discussed mergers over glasses of Glenfiddich 21, while women adorned in Chanel and Cartier scrolled through their phones, their faces impassive masks of practiced elegance. Into this meticulously crafted world walked Elias Sterling. He was an anomaly, a glitch in the opulent matrix. He stood for a moment just inside the frosted glass doors, his presence immediately drawing a constellation of disapproving glances. He wasn't dressed for Zenith Premier. He was dressed for a world of grit and labor. His field jacket, a faded olive drab, was frayed at the cuffs and bore a faint dark stain near the pocket that might have been grease or oil. His work boots, thick-soled and scuffed, still held the ghosts of dried mud in their treads. A simple, well-worn leather backpack was slung over one shoulder, and his face, etched with the fine lines of fatigue and concentration, was framed by a beard that was more functional than fashionable. He looked to the casual, judgmental eye like a man who had wandered in from the street, not from the priority check-in. A couple seated in a prime alcove, Richard and Catherine Davenport were the first to audibly react. Richard, a man whose sense of self-worth was directly proportional to the price tag on his Brioni suit, nudged his wife without taking his eyes off Elias. "Catherine, look at that." He murmured, his voice a low hiss of contempt. "How on earth did security let that thing in here? This is a private lounge, not a public shelter." Catherine, who had painstakingly cultivated the appearance of old money, despite its recent vintage, raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. She clutched her Hermes Birkin bag a little tighter. "It's appalling, Richard. The standards are slipping. We pay thousands for our membership, for the ambiance, for the exclusivity. This completely shatters it." Elias, seemingly oblivious, scanned the lounge. He wasn't looking for luxury. He was looking for an outlet. He spotted an empty armchair in a quiet corner near a charging station. He made his way toward it, his heavy boots making a soft, rhythmic thud on the polished Italian marble, a sound as out of place as a drumbeat in a library. As he passed the Davenport's table, the scent of fresh air engine fuel and something vaguely earthy trailed him. Catherine recoiled theatrically, waving a hand in front of her nose. "My God, he smells like a mechanic's garage," she whispered loudly to her husband. Richard's face hardened. This was more than a simple breach of decorum. It was a personal affront to his carefully constructed world. He had clawed his way up to this level of society, and he guarded its gates with the ferocity of the newly converted. A man like Elias Sterling, in his view, didn't just lower the tone, he actively contaminated it. Elias settled into the armchair, shrugging off his heavy backpack. He pulled out a worn paperback novel and a charging cable. He plugged his phone into the wall and leaned back with a sigh, the leather of the chair groaning in protest. He closed his eyes for just a moment, a picture of weary contentment. For the other passengers he was a spectacle. A middle-aged woman pointed him out to her friend, her mouth forming the silent word, homeless. A young tech entrepreneur who prided himself on his disruptive thinking simply scoffed at the audacity. This wasn't disruption. It was dereliction. Richard Davenport watched Elias for another 5 minutes, his irritation simmering into a low boil. The man was making no effort to blend in. He hadn't ordered a drink. He was just sitting there, existing his worn-out presence, a stain on the lounge's pristine canvas. For Richard, inaction was no longer an option. He stood up, adjusted his silk tie, and strode with purpose towards the front desk, his expression one of grave concern. He was about to correct this error to restore the natural order of things. Amelia Cortez, the lounge manager, prided herself on her unflappable professionalism. In her 5 years with Zenith, she had dealt with delayed billionaires, intoxicated celebrities, and demanding diplomats. She was a master of the polite but firm refusal, the empathetic but non-negotiable solution. When she saw Richard Davenport approaching his face, a thundercloud of indignation, she prepared her customer service smile and braced for impact. "Good afternoon, Mr. Davenport. Is everything to your satisfaction?" she asked, her voice smooth and practiced. "Far from it," Amelia Richards said, leaning conspiratorially over the marble countertop. He gestured with his head towards the corner where Elias was sitting. "I want to know why that man is in our lounge." Amelia's gaze followed his. She had noticed Elias when he'd checked in. His first-class ticket, a fully flexible intercontinental booking, was perfectly valid. His Zenith Black Diamond status was top tier. But his appearance, it was to put it mildly unconventional for their clientele. She had felt a flicker of cognitive dissonance, but the system had green-lit him without a single flag. "Sir, he is a ticketed passenger with full lounge access," Amelia replied calmly, though a knot of unease was tightening in her stomach. "I don't care what his ticket says. Look at him," Richard insisted, his voice rising just enough to turn heads. "He's filthy. He looks like he's been sleeping on a park bench. He is making my wife and I'm sure many of your other guests, extremely uncomfortable. There is a certain standard of decorum, a dress code, that is implicit in a place like this." Catherine had now joined him, standing a step behind, as a silent, impeccably dressed reinforcement. "We come here for a premium experience, an escape," she added, her tone dripping with disappointment. This is simply not it." Amelia was caught. On one hand, she had the rules, the computer system, the valid credentials. On the other, she had the powerful, unwritten rule of the service industry, the comfort of the majority. Especially the wealthy vocal majority often trumped the rights of the quiet individual. The Davenports were regulars, big spenders. Elias Sterling was an unknown quantity who was actively disrupting the lounge's precious ambiance. "I understand your concern," Amelia said, her smile tightening. "Allow me to have a quiet word with the gentleman." "See that you do," Richard said dismissively, turning back to his seat, as if the matter was already resolved. With a deep breath, Amelia walked across the lounge. Each step felt heavy. She hated this part of her job, the enforcement of subjective standards. As she approached, Elias opened his eyes and looked up at her, his expression neutral. He hadn't been reading his book. He'd been observing. "Good afternoon," Sir Amelia began, forcing a pleasant tone. "My name is Amelia. I'm the manager of the Premier Lounge. A pleasure to meet you, Amelia." Elias said, his voice surprisingly deep and steady. "Sir, I'm afraid I have to address a delicate matter," she continued, lowering her voice. We have received some complaints from other guests regarding our lounge's atmosphere. We strive to maintain a certain business-casual environment for the comfort of everyone." Elias glanced down at his own clothes, then looked back at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "And my clothes are not up to that standard. We do have a loosely enforced dress code, sir. I'm afraid your attire is a little too casual for the lounge," she said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. There was no formal dress code, not really. It was an unwritten rule, a barrier of expectation. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in the main concourse. I can offer you some vouchers for any of the restaurants out there on behalf of the airline." She was offering to pay him to leave. Elias remained seated, his gaze unwavering. "Let me be clear. You are asking me to leave this lounge for which I am a paying member and a valid ticket holder because of the way I'm dressed. I'm asking for your cooperation to ensure the comfort of all our guests." She hedged, feeling the weakness of her own position. "My comfort doesn't count. I take it Elias stated not as a question, but as a conclusion." He shook his head slowly. "No, Amelia. I'm not leaving. I've had a very long day. I have a long flight ahead of me, and I'm going to wait for it right here." His refusal, though spoken calmly, was absolute. It hung in the air between them, a declaration of defiance. From across the room, Richard Davenport watched his lips curled into a sneer. He saw the manager failing. It was time to escalate. He stood up again, his patience completely gone. This was no longer about ambiance. It was about authority, his authority, and he was about to exert it. The quiet refusal from Elias Sterling sent a ripple of tension through the air that was palpable. Amelia was momentarily speechless, her carefully constructed script of corporate politeness rendered useless. She had expected compliance, perhaps a grumbled acceptance, but not this calm, immovable resistance. Richard Davenport, however, saw his opening. He marched over his expensive leather shoes, clicking angrily on the floor. He didn't address Elias directly. Instead, he loomed over Amelia, treating her as a disobedient subordinate. "Is there a problem here, Amelia?" He demanded, his voice laced with menace. "I thought I made myself perfectly clear. This individual needs to be removed. Now." "So the gentleman is refusing to leave," Amelia stammered, feeling control of the situation slipping through her fingers. Richard finally turned his venomous gaze on Elias, who was still seated, watching the scene unfold with an unnerving placidity. "Listen to me, you..." Richard spat, pointing a finger at him. "I don't know what little game you're playing, or how you scammed your way in here, but it's over. You will get up, and you will walk out of that door, or I will have you thrown out. Do you understand me?" Elias slowly placed his book on the small table beside him. He looked from Richard's furious face to Amelia's panicked one. "I understand that you're making a scene, Mr. Davenport, Richard Davenport," he announced, as if the name itself should carry enough weight to crush all opposition. "And people in this airline know my name. I spend over $100,000 a year with Zenith. I know the Vice President of North American Operations, Robert McKinley, personally. A single phone call from me, Amelia, could have serious consequences for your career." It was a classic power play, and a brutally effective one. Amelia's face paled. The name Robert McKinley was a big one, a name that appeared in corporate memos, and whose displeasure could mean instant dismissal. The unspoken threat was clear. It was her job or this man's seat. The choice seemed obvious. "Sir," she said, her voice now trembling slightly as she turned back to Elias, "I am no longer asking. On behalf of Zenith Airlines, I am instructing you to vacate the lounge immediately. If you fail to comply, I will be forced to call airport security." Elias held her gaze for a long moment, a profound sense of disappointment washing over his features. He wasn't angry. He was weary. He had seen this play out before, in different arenas, the automatic assumption of malice or inferiority, based on nothing more than appearance. "You're making a grave mistake, Amelia," he said softly. The quiet warning only enraged Richard further. "A mistake. The only mistake was letting you in. That's it, I'm done with this." He pulled out his phone, a brand new iPhone Pro Max. "Security now," he barked at Amelia as if she were his personal assistant. Shaking, Amelia spoke into her lapel mic. "This is Amelia Cortez in the Premier Lounge. I require security assistance for a non-compliant individual." Within 2 minutes, 2 Port Authority police officers arrived. They were large, stoic men whose expressions betrayed a weariness with the petty dramas of the airport. They approached the scene cautiously, their eyes assessing the situation, the irate, well-dressed man, the stressed manager, and the calm, poorly dressed man in the chair. "What's the problem here?" the senior officer, Officer Miller, asked. "This man is trespassing," Richard declared before Amelia could speak. "He has been asked to leave by the lounge manager and is refusing. He is disturbing the peace and making the guests uncomfortable." Officer Miller turned to Elias. "Sir, is this true? Have you been asked to leave the premises?" Elias finally stood up. He wasn't as tall as Richard, but he possessed a solid, grounded presence that the other man lacked. "Yes, I have," Elias said evenly. "On the grounds that Mr. Davenport here doesn't like my jacket." "It's about maintaining standards," Richard blustered. Officer Miller sighed. He'd seen this 100 times. "Sir," he said to Elias, his tone firm but not aggressive, "this is a private lounge. If management asks you to leave, you have to leave. We can discuss the reasons later, but right now you need to come with us." The entire lounge was now watching phones discreetly pointed in their direction. It was a moment of public humiliation. Elias was being escorted out by the police, branded a trespasser, a bum, a problem to be removed. But then Elias did something no one expected. He didn't argue. He didn't resist. He simply held up a hand. "Hold on," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. He reached into his jacket pocket, but he didn't pull out a wallet or an ID. He pulled out his phone. "You're right. This has gone on long enough. It's time to clear this up." He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb moving with deliberate slowness. Richard scoffed. "Who are you calling your public defender?" Elias ignored him. He found the name he was looking for and pressed the call button. He put the phone to his ear. "Yes, connect me, please," he said into the phone. The lounge was dead silent. "James, it's Elias." He paused, listening. "I'm fine, thanks. Listen, I'm at our JFK T4 lounge. Yes, Zenith Premier. There seems to be a bit of a policy disagreement. I need you to speak with the lounge manager. Her name is Amelia." He held the phone out to the stunned manager. "Mr. James Harrison would like to speak with you." The name dropped into the silence like a 10-ton weight. James Harrison, the CEO of Zenith Air Group. Amelia stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. Richard Davenport's smug expression faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face for the first time. This had to be a bluff. A desperate, insane bluff. Trembling, Amelia took the phone. She raised it to her ear. "Hello," she whispered. "This is Amelia Cortez." And as she listened to the voice on the other end, the blood drained from her face, her expression shifting from panic to sheer, unadulterated terror. The silence in the Zenith Premier Lounge was absolute, broken only by the faint, tinny sound of a powerful voice emanating from the phone in Amelia's hand. Every eye was fixed on her, watching as a wave of emotions washed over her face. Confusion, dawning comprehension, and finally, a deep, stomach-churning horror. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the phone. Her professionally pleasant mask had completely crumbled, replaced by the raw fear of someone who has just realized they have made a catastrophic, career-ending mistake. Richard Davenport's bluster had evaporated, replaced by a nervous agitation. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he could read the universal language of terror on Amelia's face. Who was this man? How could he possibly have the personal number of the CEO? It had to be a trick. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely no more than 60 seconds, Amelia spoke, her voice a choked whisper. "Yes, Mr. Harrison. I understand. Completely. Yes, sir. He's right here." She lowered the phone, her hand shaking so violently she almost dropped it. She didn't look at Richard or the police officers. She looked only at Elias, her eyes wide, with a mixture of awe and dread. She extended the phone back to him, her gesture as reverent as if she were returning a holy relic. Mr. Sterling," she stammered the name, an unfamiliar weight on her tongue. "My deepest, most sincere apologies. I had no idea." Elias took his phone back, his expression unchanged. It was not triumphant, but grave. "No," he said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "You didn't." Officer Miller, the policeman, stepped forward, his professional instincts kicking in. "I'm sorry, sir, but what's going on here? Who are you?" Before Elias could answer, Amelia found her voice, shaky as it was. "This is Mr. Elias Sterling," she announced to the room at large, her words directed at the police at the Davenports and at every other passenger who had been watching. He is the chairman of the board of directors for the Zenith Air Group." A collective gasp went through the lounge. It wasn't just a title, chairman of the board. That meant he wasn't just an executive. He was James Harrison's boss. He was, for all intents and purposes, the ultimate authority, the majority shareholder, the owner. Richard Davenport looked as if he had been physically struck. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty grey pallor. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Catherine clutched his arm, her knuckles white her own face, a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. They hadn't just insulted a fellow passenger. They hadn't just picked a fight with a wealthy man. They had tried to have the owner of the entire airline thrown out of his own lounge. The two police officers exchanged a look and took a subtle step back, instantly recalibrating the situation. This was no longer a simple matter of a non-compliant trespasser. This was a corporate issue far above their pay grade. "Is there anything you need from us, Mr. Sterling?" Officer Miller asked, his tone now deferential. "No, thank you, officers," Elias said calmly. "Your presence is no longer required. The situation is under control." The officers nodded and quietly, efficiently made their exit, leaving the lounge to its own internal reckoning. Elias Sterling now stood in the center of the room, the focal point of everyone's attention. His worn jacket and muddy boots hadn't changed, but the perception of them had. They were no longer signs of poverty. They were emblems of eccentricity, the confident indifference of a man so powerful he had no need for the approval of others. He was Mark Zuckerberg in a hoodie, Warren Buffett in a beat-up sedan. He was a man who valued substance over surface, and the entire room had failed his silent test. He turned his attention first to Amelia, who stood frozen, awaiting her sentence. "Amelia," he began, and she flinched at the sound of her name. "Zenith's core principle is not luxury. It's not exclusivity. It's service. It's about providing dignity and respect to every single person who entrusts their journey to us. not just the ones who wear the right suits. He paused, letting the words sink in. You didn't fail because you listened to a complaining customer. You failed when you judged a man by his clothes instead of his character, or at the very least, by the valid ticket in his name. You failed when you chose the path of least resistance instead of the path of principle. He then turned his gaze to the Davenports, who seemed to shrink under his scrutiny. Richard was sweating visibly now, his expensive suit feeling like a lead weight. And you, Mr. Davenport, Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. You seem to believe that the money you spend gives you the right to dictate the worth of others, that your status gives you dominion over a space shared by all. You wanted to know who I was. I'm a mechanic. I'm an engineer. I'm a man who just spent the last 48 hours getting his hands dirty at one of our new sustainable aviation fuel refineries in rural Maine, working to ensure the very planes you fly on have a future. These clothes, he said, gesturing to his jacket, are the result of actual work, not of sitting in an office complaining about the decor. He took a step closer. You didn't just insult me. You insulted every mechanic, every baggage handler, every grounds crew member, every hard-working person whose labor makes your comfortable life possible. You saw dirt and assumed worthlessness. That is a blindness that no amount of money can cure. His words were not shouted. They were delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, cutting through layers of arrogance and entitlement to strike at the core of their character. The public humiliation the Davenports had intended for Elias had been turned back on them, magnified 1,000 times over. They stood there, exposed and utterly disgraced, in a room full of their peers, under the unwavering gaze of the man they had tried to destroy. The aftermath of the revelation was a thick, suffocating silence. The Davenports stood marooned in the middle of the lounge, the target of dozens of pairs of eyes. Their faces, once masks of indignant superiority, were now pale and slack with shock. Richard's carefully constructed world of status and influence had been demolished in less than 5 minutes, not by a show of wealth, but by a quiet statement of fact. Elias Sterling didn't gloat. There was no "I told you so" in his demeanor, no triumphant smirk. There was only a profound and heavy disappointment. He looked at the cowering couple and shook his head, not in anger, but in something closer to pity. The flight to London will be boarding shortly, he said, his voice returning to a normal conversational tone that was somehow more chilling than his previous condemnation. He picked up his backpack and his book, his movements unhurried. As he turned to leave, a young flight attendant who had been discreetly preparing for the pre-boarding announcements approached him. Her name was Chloe, and she had witnessed the entire exchange from a distance. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Your suite is ready for you whenever you are. Please allow me to escort you to the gate for priority boarding." She had treated him with the same polite respect when he had first entered the lounge, offering him a drink, which he had politely declined. She had seen a tired traveler, not a social class. Elias gave her a small, genuine smile, the first he'd shown since entering the lounge. "Thank you, Chloe. I'd appreciate that." As they walked towards the exit, passing the still-frozen Davenports, Elias paused beside their alcove. He spoke without looking at them, his words meant for them alone. "For the record, Mr. Davenport," he said, quietly, "I know Robert McKinley. We play golf sometimes. He's a good man. He'll be very interested to hear about your interpretation of the Zenith customer experience. I'm sure he'll also be fascinated to learn how you leverage his name to bully service employees." Richard flinched as if he'd been struck. The name he had used as a weapon was now a harbinger of his own doom. Elias and Chloe left the lounge, leaving behind a wake of stunned silence. The moment the door closed, the spell was broken. A low murmur erupted as people began whispering furiously to each other, recounting what they had just witnessed. The story was already taking on a life of its own, a modern fable of hubris and humility. The Davenports finally moved, slinking back to their seats like chastised children. The Glenfiddich in Richard's glass had lost its appeal. The comfort of the leather chairs felt suffocating. They were surrounded by luxury, but all they felt was the cold chill of their own public disgrace. Their flight to London, once an exciting prospect, now loomed like a trip to the gallows. They would have to sit on that plane for 7 hours, knowing the man they tried to eject owned the very vehicle they were flying in. Meanwhile, Amelia Cortez stood by her desk, her legs feeling like jelly. Her career at Zenith, a job she loved and had worked tirelessly for, was over. She knew it. She had failed the most important test imaginable. She began to mechanically type out her letter of resignation on her computer, her vision blurred by tears of regret. She had let a bully dictate her actions, and in doing so, had betrayed the very core principles of her profession. The consequences, she knew, would be swift and severe. A few minutes later, her corporate phone rang. The caller ID displayed a name that made her heart stop: James Harrison. With a trembling hand, she answered, prepared for the verbal execution she so richly deserved. "Amelia Cortez speaking," she whispered. "Amelia, this is James Harrison." The CEO's voice was crisp and businesslike, devoid of anger, but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "Mr. Sterling has already filled me in. Do not submit your resignation. We'll be talking tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp. We have a lot to discuss about the future of Zenith's hospitality training. A lot." He hung up. Amelia stared at the phone, bewildered. It wasn't the firing she expected. It was something else, something far more complicated. She had a sinking feeling that her punishment wouldn't be a simple termination, but a long, arduous penance. The reckoning had begun, and it was far from over. Karma Elias Sterling believed wasn't a mystical force. It was the logical and often delayed consequence of one's actions, a Newtonian law applied to the moral universe. For the Davenports, the consequences were neither logical nor delayed. They were immediate, brutal, and viral. The bubble of the Zenith Premier Lounge had burst, and the story of the incident, supercharged by the schadenfreude of the digital age, became a global phenomenon before their flight to London even began its descent over the Irish Sea. Witnesses in the lounge, a potent mix of tech entrepreneurs, journalists, and socialites, had their phones out. The story hit Twitter now, X and LinkedIn, in a flurry of posts. "You won't believe what just happened in the JFK Zenith Lounge," one began. "A lesson in humility. The arrogant suit versus the quiet owner." "What don't judge my horse," read another. By the time the Boeing 777's wheels touched down at Heathrow, the story had been picked up by popular blogs and news aggregators. Anonymous quotes from passengers painted a vivid picture. This man in a Brioni suit was screaming at a guy in work boots, calling him homeless, a witness was quoted. Then the guy in the boots makes one phone call to the CEO. Turns out he's the chairman. The silence that followed was deafening. When Richard and Catherine Davenport finally switched their phones off airplane mode, they were hit by a digital tsunami. A deluge of notifications, missed calls, and a flood of frantic text messages from friends and colleagues bombarded their screens. "Richard, what is this I'm hearing about an incident at JFK? Catherine, is this story about you? Call me." They were trending not by name at first, but the descriptions were so surgically precise, a loud investment banker and his wife with the Hermes bag, that their anonymity was shredded. Their carefully curated image was shattered, replaced by a caricature of entitled arrogance for the world to see and condemn. For Richard Davenport, the professional fallout was a masterclass in corporate execution. He spent the weekend in a state of self-deluding panic, convincing himself he could manage the narrative. He drafted emails, prepared talking points, and planned to frame the incident as an overzealous attempt to maintain brand standards. He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of his crime. It wasn't about standards, it was about character. On Monday morning, he walked into the gleaming, monolithic headquarters of Goldman Sachs in Lower Manhattan, his suit feeling less like armor and more like a costume. The usual hum of quiet, ferocious ambition felt different. The glances from his colleagues were furtive, laced with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. He hadn't even reached his desk when his assistant intercepted him, her face pale. "Mr. Chen wants to see you," she said, avoiding his eyes. "Now." David Chen was the regional director, a man who occupied the rarefied air of the top floor. A summons to his office was either for a coronation or an execution. As Richard rode the silent high-speed elevator, he felt a cold dread pooling in his stomach. Chen's office was a cathedral of minimalist power, with a view that encompassed the Statue of Liberty and the sprawling expanse of the harbor. He wasn't sitting behind his vast mahogany desk. He was standing by the window hands clasped behind his back. He didn't turn when Richard entered. "Reputation Deschott." Chen began, his voice calm and resonant. "It's our most valuable asset. More than our capital, more than our algorithms. It's the trust that clients place in our judgment. It is the currency of this firm." He finally turned his eyes as cold and grey as the morning sky. On a low table between two chairs sat a tablet displaying a news article titled, "Billionaire Airline Chairman Humiliates Wolf of Wall Street Wannabe in Viral Airport Showdown." "Sit down," Chen commanded. Richard obeyed, his legs feeling weak. Over the weekend, Chen continued, taking the opposite seat. "I received a phone call. It was not, as you might expect, an angry, screaming call. It was from Elias Sterling. He was remarkably composed. He explained that he holds a significant personal portfolio with our private wealth management division. He also pointed out that our firm's investment banking arm manages a multi-billion-dollar relationship with his parent company, the Zenith Air Group. He described you, a senior vice president of Goldman Sachs, threatening a service employee and attempting to have him, a major client, forcibly removed from his own property, all while name-dropping our firm as a tool of intimidation. Richard opened his mouth to speak, to offer his carefully rehearsed excuses. "It was a misunderstanding." "No." Chen cut him off, his voice dropping to an icy whisper. "It was a catastrophic failure of judgment. You took our name, our reputation, and you dragged it into a public spectacle of petty class warfare. You exposed this firm to immense reputational risk and jeopardized a key client relationship, not for any strategic reason, but to soothe your own fragile ego. You became a liability, Richard, and we do not tolerate liabilities." The rest was a blur of corporate procedure. A human resources executive entered the room, her expression neutral. Richard was informed his employment was terminated effective immediately for gross misconduct and actions detrimental to the firm's reputation. His security badge was deactivated remotely. He was informed he would be escorted to his desk to collect his personal belongings and then escorted from the building. There was no severance package, no negotiation, just the cold, swift amputation of his career. As he walked through the trading floor flanked by security, carrying a cardboard box filled with a few personal effects, the silence was absolute. Every eye was on him, a fallen prince being paraded through his former kingdom. For Catherine Davenport, The karma was quieter, but no less devastating. Her currency was social standing, and she was now bankrupt. The first blow came from Beatrice Fairchild, the formidable matriarch who chaired the committee for the Metropolitan Museum's prestigious Spring Benefit. The call came Tuesday morning. "Catherine, darling." Beatrice's voice was like honey laced with poison. "I'm calling about the benefit committee. There's been a shift in focus for this year's event. Given the rather unfortunate publicity you and Richard are currently navigating, the committee feels your involvement would be a distraction from our fundraising goals." "I'm sure you understand." It was a social execution, delivered with a smile. Her phone, once a constant buzz of invitations and gossip, fell silent. She saw pictures on Instagram of her closest friends at a luncheon. She hadn't been invited to their smiles, seeming to mock her from the screen. She was erased from guest lists, her name becoming a punchline in the very circles she had fought so desperately to conquer. The status she had built her identity around was an illusion, and it had vanished, leaving her in a silent, gilded cage of her own making. Amelia Cortez, meanwhile, faced her own reckoning. The 9 a.m. video call was with both James Harrison, the CEO, and Elias Sterling. She started by offering her immediate resignation, her voice shaking as she took full responsibility. Elias let her finish his expression, unreadable. "Your resignation is denied, Amelia." He said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Firing you is the easy solution. It's also the wrong one." Another manager faced with the same pressure from a man like Richard Davenport might make the same mistake. You, however, will not. You are now uniquely qualified to teach the lesson we so clearly need to learn. James Harrison leaned into the camera. "We're creating a new executive position, effective immediately, Vice President of Hospitality and Service Culture. It's your position, Amelia. Your first and only task for the next 18 months will be to design and personally implement a company-wide retraining program which we're calling the Dignity in Service Initiative." Amelia stared speechless. "You will travel to every major Zenith hub across the globe," Elias continued. "You will stand in front of every class of our customer-facing employees, and you will begin every single training session by telling them exactly what happened in the JFK lounge. You will deconstruct your own failure, the unconscious bias, the intimidation, the choice to protect a bully over a paying customer. Your mistake will become our foundational text. You will not be allowed to forget it. You will be forced to transform your greatest professional shame into this company's most valuable asset." It was a staggering, almost cruel form of justice. Not a termination, but a penance. A long, arduous path to redemption, where she would have to own her mistake, not in private, but as a public declaration over and over again. Her career wasn't over. It had been forged anew in the fire of her own flawed judgment, with a singular, inescapable mission to ensure no one at Zenith Airlines ever made the same mistake again. 6 months later, the relentless pace of the world had moved on, and the viral storm of the JFK lounge incident had subsided into a quiet yet permanent part of Zenith Airlines' corporate lore. It was a modern fable, whispered in break rooms and taught in boardrooms, a defining moment that had forced a deep, systemic cultural shift. Spring had arrived in New York, breathing new life into the city, and Elias Sterling found himself walking through the familiar expanse of Terminal 4 once more. He wasn't there for an official inspection. Officially, he was simply a passenger on a flight to Seattle for a quarterly review with an aerospace engineering firm. But unofficially, this was a personal audit. He wanted to see with his own eyes if the changes he had set in motion were real or merely cosmetic, a temporary bandage on a deep wound. He was dressed simply again in dark jeans, a comfortable Henley shirt, and the same worn leather backpack. It wasn't a test this time, but simply who he was. His first observation came before he even reached the lounge. At the security checkpoint, a family was struggling, their children fussy, and their carry-on bags a chaotic jumble. The Zenith agent assigned to the priority line, instead of showing impatience, stepped out from behind her podium. She knelt down, offered the children a small pin shaped like a Zenith jet, and spoke to the flustered parents with a calm, reassuring empathy that instantly lowered the temperature of the situation. Elias watched for a moment, unseen, and felt a flicker of genuine hope. He entered the Zenith Premier Lounge. The physical space was unchanged, the same Italian marble, the same scent of espresso and leather, the same panoramic view of the airfield. But the soul of the place felt different. The stiff, judgmental silence had been replaced by a low, comfortable hum of activity. The staff moved with a relaxed confidence, their smiles reaching their eyes. They engaged with everyone from the seasoned business traveler to a young woman who looked like a student, her lap buried under textbooks. Elias took a seat in a quiet corner, the very same one he had occupied 6 months prior, and observed. He watched the new lounge manager, a sharp young man named David, navigate the floor. A family with a baby arrived, and David immediately guided them to a more private, secluded alcove without being asked. He then approached an elderly gentleman who seemed confused about his flight time, patiently pulling up the information on a tablet and explaining the gate change. The most telling moment came when a young man, clearly a musician, entered, carrying a battered sticker-covered cello case. He was dressed in a ragged band t-shirt and ripped jeans. 6 months ago, he would have been the target of scorn, another anomaly to be removed. Today, David approached him with a warm welcome. "That's a beautiful instrument," David said, his voice full of genuine interest. "Let me find a safe place for it by the front desk while you relax. Can I get you anything to drink?" The musician, who had entered with a defensive posture, visibly relaxed, a grateful smile spreading across his face. This, Elias thought, was the change. It wasn't about enforcing a new dress code. It was about abolishing the unwritten one. It was the proactive application of dignity. After a few minutes, David's eyes scanned the room and landed on Elias. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by a moment of professional composure. He approached not with the fawning deference of someone meeting a celebrity, but with the quiet respect of an employee greeting the head of the company. "Mr. Sterling," he said in a low voice, "welcome. It is an honor to have you with us. Please let me know if there's anything you need." "David," Elias replied, shaking his offered hand. "You and your team are running a fine operation here. I was just admiring how you helped the young man with the cello." David's face lit up with pride. "Thank you, sir. That's the Cortez Initiative in action. The first thing VP Cortez taught us was to see the person, not the package. It's actually made the job much more rewarding." The mention of Amelia's new title and the program named after her, a permanent institutional reminder of her crucible, was all the confirmation Elias needed. The seeds of change had taken root. The ripple effects of that autumn afternoon had spread far and wide, altering the trajectory of every key player. Amelia Cortez had become an unlikely but powerful force for change within Zenith. From her new home base in Chicago, she crisscrossed the globe, a corporate evangelist with a powerful sermon. She was currently in the Singapore hub, standing before a room of senior, battle-hardened ground staff. She began her presentation as she always did. "Good morning. My name is Amelia Cortez, and 6 months ago I called security to have the chairman of our company forcibly removed from our JFK lounge because I decided he looked homeless. The confession delivered without self-pity was a masterstroke. It disarmed her audience and gave her an unassailable moral authority. Her mistake was now her greatest asset. The training modules she designed were not sterile corporate slideshows. They were raw, honest case studies in human psychology, unconscious bias, and the profound business case for empathy. The results were tangible. Customer satisfaction scores in lounges and at gates were at an all-time high. Employee morale had lifted. Amelia, who thought her career was over, was now seen as one of the most effective and respected executives in the company, her redemption story a source of inspiration. Chloe, the flight attendant, whose simple kindness had stood out in stark relief, had flourished. Now an in-flight service manager, she was a rising star known for her grace and exceptional leadership. She was often tasked with training the next generation of cabin crew, and she always incorporated the story of that day into her teaching, framing it as the ultimate lesson in service. "Never assume," she would tell her trainees. "The person in seat 34B might be more important than the one in 1A. Treat them that way. Your job is to serve with dignity universally and without exception." And the Davenports. Their world had not ended, but it had been irrevocably and justly diminished. They had sold the sprawling mansion in Connecticut, its upkeep an impossible burden, without Richard's Goldman Sachs salary. They now lived in a respectable but anonymous two-bedroom apartment on the Upper East Side, the kind of place they once would have pitied. The silence between them was heavy with the ghost of their former life. Richard had eventually found work. Not on Wall Street, where his name was now toxic, but at a small regional logistics consulting firm. His days were spent not in high-stakes negotiations, but in crafting mundane PowerPoint presentations for middle managers. The arrogance had been sandblasted away, replaced by the weary resignation of a man forced to confront his own mediocrity. Catherine's social exile was complete. The world of charity galas and exclusive luncheons was now a foreign country she could only observe through the pages of magazines. Her days were spent in a quiet anonymity she had once feared above all else. One afternoon, while pushing a shopping cart through a Trader Joe's, she saw a woman she once considered a dear friend. Their eyes met for a fleeting second before the other woman looked away, pretending not to have seen her. In that moment of casual, brutal dismissal, Catherine finally understood the cold, sharp pain of being judged and found wanting. Their punishment was not poverty, but irrelevance. As Elias sat in the lounge, the boarding call for his flight to Seattle was announced. He gathered his things and stood up, giving a final nod to David. As he walked toward the gate, he looked out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. A Zenith 787 Dreamliner was pushing back its graceful carbon fiber wings, flexing as it prepared to ascend. He thought of the thousands of people whose lives were connected to that single aircraft, the engineers who designed its turbines, the mechanics who serviced its landing gear, the baggage handlers who loaded its cargo, the pilots in the cockpit, the flight attendants preparing the cabin. His company wasn't just a collection of assets and stock prices. It was a complex human ecosystem, and his job was to ensure it was a healthy one. The incident 6 months ago had been a cancer, a pocket of arrogant rot that threatened to spread. Excising it hadn't been an act of revenge. It had been an act of necessity, a painful but essential surgery to restore the core values of the organization he had built. He had held up a mirror, and the consequences had simply been the natural reflection of the characters within. The world was still full of judgment and prejudice, but here within the small universe he controlled, he had enforced a new standard. Dignity was now policy. Respect was now the rule. And that he reflected as he walked down the jet bridge was a legacy worth more than any stock price. This story is a powerful testament to a simple, universal truth. True class has nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with how you treat people. Elias Sterling didn't need to raise his voice or flash his money to prove his worth. His character did it for him. The Davenports learned the hard way that the status they worshipped was built on a foundation of sand easily washed away by the tide of their own arrogance. It's a stark reminder that in a world obsessed with appearances, the most valuable currency we have is respect. We never truly know the story of the person standing next to us, and judging a book by its cover can lead to your own chapter ending in disgrace. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And for more real-life stories that explore karma justice and the complexities of the human experience, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. Thank you for listening.